So to start out, you know, I'm a big baseball fan, and anytime I go to a baseball game, I have a scorecard because I like to keep track of what's going on. And one of the great scorecard keepers in our industry is Nielsen. So we're going to have Andrew Lafiosca come by, give a quick snapshot of what he's seeing in the sports industry. He and I will talk for a couple minutes, and then we'll get a bunch of panelists up. Thank you all very much, and where's Andrew?
Good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing?
Great.
Thankfully, we're here today and not tomorrow with the next snowstorm that's about to hit New York. So we're going to talk a little bit, before we get into that slide, we're going to talk a little bit about some broad topics. We're going to look at consumption changes in sports and entertainment. We're going to touch a little bit about how connectivity in the homes has impacted that. Talk a little bit about the sponsorship categories as a whole. And then we're going to kind of end it with a little touch on esports at the end, which will transition nicely into our panel. And if you haven't figured out, I can't stand behind a podium. So I'm going to be walking around a little bit, but hopefully it's not too distracting. So let's get into it. In the last 15 years, nothing has evolved more than the access to content through the ability to access content in multiple different ways. If we look at 2017 to 2012, the 5-year difference, there's a significant increase in the ability for consumers to grab content in the means that they deem best for themselves, right? So we go from a push to a pull environment, right? So 15, 20 years ago, it was a push environment where advertisers can just push out their content, fans would get it, to an environment now which is very much a pull environment. Consumers pull down what they want when they want it. And so we thought this was an interesting slide to put up there to give a little bit more of a visual understanding of just how great that change has been over the last 15 or so years, even in the last 5 years. So obviously, weekly time spent based on the total US population in hours is just significantly increased. This is all content consumption combined, over 72 hours or so per week per person, right? So very much an indicator that if it's out there and people are interested, they're going to find it, but they're going to find it in the way that they want to find it. So how is this happening, or why is this happening? Well, the ability to access this content has dramatically increased as well over the last few years. Internet connectivity and internet connectivity devices in the home is up 53% just in the last year. Over 74 million TV households, or just over 62%, have one of these types of devices in their home. And they're using these devices excuse me, to consume your content, or sports content, or entertainment content, whatever content that may be. So obviously, as technology increases and the ability to access services that are reliable and fast speeds will obviously drive the ability for people to consume more content in multiple different ways. All right? So these two go hand in hand. Last two slides. The more access we have to the content or services that will drive that content, obviously the more hours spent consuming that content. But let's not forget that live TV is not necessarily going anywhere. Yes, content consumption is changing. The share of voice may be changing, but live TV is still king. Okay? Sports especially. 86 out of the top 100 live television and same-day television events in 2017 was sports programming. 9 out of the top 10 were sports programming. Anybody have a guess on what that other one in the top 10 might have been last year? No? It was a pretty wacky year politics-wise, but it wasn't politics. No, it was actually last year's Oscars. Not this year's, but last year's Oscars was in the top 10. I believe it was number 9. But when you look at sports as a platform, over 134,000 broadcast hours in 2017 alone in sports live broadcast and shoulder programming. All right, so sports is probably the one area where we survive the video on demand, DVR, I'll consume it later trend, right? Because who wants to watch sports on replay when Twitter's already told you what's happened, right? So sports is going to continue to be a major player, as it has always been, but a major player moving forward that we see surviving the trend of consuming content when it's convenient. Because once the game's over, you already know the score, and you've kind of missed that magic. So with sports being a dominant player in terms of live consumption, what does that mean for sponsorship? Well, sponsorship exposure value, or value attributed to being exposed in sports broadcasts, whether it's a dasher board in a hockey game, home plate rotational in a baseball game, you name it, is continually increasing. And significantly. I mean, if you look at the top 5 categories in sports sponsorship, insurance, banking, financial services, tires, and healthcare, they've all seen 4-year growth, year over year for the most part. Maybe a dip here and there from 15, 16 to 16, 17 for financial services. But in general, straight line growth from 13, 14 until 16, 17. And this metric is driven primarily through total viewership. All right? So as we look at total viewership as a part of what we're trying to accomplish as brands and marketers, we're still reaching a ton of people through sports entertainment. It's still a very viable platform. So when we talk about esports and what's next from a sponsorship standpoint, we feel very, very confident. And I think the panel will go into this in a lot more detail. We feel very, very confident that esports is also going to continue significant growth. If you look at the total number of deals for the last year, I believe this is 2017, 16, 17, over 600 total deals done in esports alone. Mostly endemic partners or endemic categories, and that's changing. I think what we've seen in the last few years is a little bit better understanding of what esports provides brands and the opportunity there. And the panel obviously will go into much more detail on this. But a tremendous opportunity with esports for those brands that can figure it out. And obviously our panelists will help you understand how to figure that out. But in general, these were the trends we wanted to share with you today. Obviously very broad, very top level. But the couple of takeaways to understand is that consumption content is growing week over week, month over month, day over day, you name it. And just because there's a diversification of content consumption doesn't necessarily mean there's a cannibalization of linear TV, right? It's the audience shifting in different areas. The key to understanding viewership trends and where they're going is the ability to deduplicate the audiences. Am I talking to the same person 5 different ways, or am I talking to 5 different people on mobile, TV, online, you name it? So that's the key moving forward. From a sponsorship standpoint, very much a uprising opportunity for brands in sponsorship, whether it's traditional sports, stick and ball, or esports. So we encourage you guys, obviously, to continue down that road with sports entertainment. It is a viable platform. It will always be destination TV, live TV programming. And I think that's about it. And Jeff, I don't know if you want to come up and...
It was interesting to me looking at your slides as you talk about the percentage of the people that were polled here who are neutral about esports. And I'm wondering if there is another category within sports that draws that level of neutrality. We're not a society known about being neutral about anything.
Yeah, so I don't think there is. And I think the neutrality around esports is generally the unknown, right? So esports is relatively new. We're only really a few years into esports as a viable platform, right? It's not baseball. It's not 125 years old. It's not the NFL. So I expect that neutrality to significantly increase as people understand what it actually is.
And as if you're offering advice, as you are here, right, to publishers and brands, does that mean that you would approach kind of programming that category differently, given that there is that kind of sense of neutrality?
Well, I think that the main theme with sponsorship, no matter where you're playing, is authenticity from a brand standpoint, right? It doesn't necessarily matter what platform you're in as long as it's authentic to the audience you're trying to reach. So whether it's esports, whether it's NFL, whether it's hockey or baseball, you name it, if you can develop an authentic partnership with the consumer base that you're trying to reach, you're going to have cut-through, you're going to have effectiveness.
So you spoke before about, and for you to quantify what we all kind of instinctively know, right? That we're going through this crazy disaggregation of consumption, and even when you talk about deduping, it's not unusual, I think, for any of us to watch a game across different devices over the course of a day. It strikes me as begging two kind of really tricky questions for you guys, right? One is how do you create kind of a coin of the realm that goes across all those consumptive experiences, and deduping is part of that, but you know, even the units of measurement that different platforms use are different, and what does the road look like to getting some degree of kind of singular currency around that? And I think the second question it begs is that from a qualitative point of view, these are different environments, right? Being one of somebody in a room this size in a public viewing area at a Buffalo Wild Wings watching a football game counts as an impression, but qualitatively speaking, it feels like maybe a different kind of impression than if I saw that in my living room. So, you know, how do we get to kind of common currency, and are there ways to start to kind of qualify the different levels of experience around those platforms?
Yeah, exactly. So Nielsen has done a tremendous job recently with building out what we call our total audience platform, our ability to measure viewership across all platforms. And a part of that process is what we call our out-of-home viewing, right? So to your second point about the quality of impression versus in a bar versus at your couch, we're able now to better understand what type of viewership lift is experienced in the bar and the on-premise standpoint. I think the NFL alone last year saw a 20 or 22% lift in viewership when we added in the out-of-home viewership numbers. And that's significant because that kind of chops away at the theory that viewership is down. And I think what it highlights is that it's not necessarily down. People just consume differently, right? So I'm in my early 40s. I probably consume content a lot different than someone who's in college at the moment. And understanding those differences across the audience and where they're consuming your content is a big part of it. But in order to get this total audience metric right and to develop numbers that are reliable and bankable, there's a need for collaboration in the industry, right? So when we talk about total audience, part of that requires the ability for our partners to install an SDK on their platforms or their apps so that we can actually get the viewership data and then bring it into our data sets and dedupe it and understand whether or not I was watching it on my phone and the TV at the same time and I'm not actually two different viewers. So I think it's there. It's a part of a growth process that the entire industry is going through, but Nielsen's at the forefront at the moment. We feel confident with total audience, and it's proven to be successful. And we point, no farther than the out-of-home release this past year in 2017 that has proved to be fairly significant from a number standpoint.
Are you guys working with the ad community, with the agencies, with the brands to try to drive that adoption? Because ultimately, it would strike me as a publisher that you all have the most leverage in this conversation, right? The ability to intelligently place dollars based on a more profound understanding as to how consumption is working is ultimately going to be a driver here. So is that something you guys are engaged in?
Yeah, I mean, we have these conversations with all our partners, whether it's a league partner, a brand partner, a publisher, you name it. I think the better we can crack the code and identify true viewership, the more effective marketing and advertising dollars can be in their spend. And the more effective they are in the spend, the more likely they're coming back to spend more the next year, right? Being able to prove that we've reached the audience that we've sold you strengthens your ability to regenerate that revenue or renew that revenue the next year. So we're constantly talking about that with all our partners. I think, like I said, it's a responsibility of the industry as a whole to collaborate on this and develop a system that is trustworthy and qualified in terms of understanding what's actually happening.
I want to get back into that notion of kind of a qualitative impression, right? And it kind of cuts a couple different ways, right? One is to be able to measure the relative efficacy or impact of one platform versus another. And the other is within the context of a lot of conversation that we've been having lately about safe environments, right? About environments that are more conducive and more comfortable for brands to be involved in. So, from a qualitative impression point of view, are you guys working towards, this is something that your old company, Repucom, was really good at, right? Being able to give some context to how the impression was consumed. Are there tools that are available now or in development that allows us to understand the relative efficacy of different platforms?
Yeah, so we do a lot of work around brand effectiveness, the ability to recall advertising in broadcast, and that could be done across multiple platforms, right? So understanding how someone who might be watching it on mobile and seeing a mobile ad versus a linear TV ad, their recall on the advertisement. So we obviously do that work. We do it quite extensively. In terms of trying to understand what to do with that information, it's a really valuable data point that we do with a lot of advertisers, right? Because an advertiser can obviously track their spend and track GRPs and understand what type of reach they've gotten through the advertising. But it's a lot harder to say, but did it cut through the clutter? Did it cut through the noise? And that's where these types of studies come in, and we help our partners understand, yes, you were visible. Yes, there was recall, but was there transfer of your message? Did people understand what you were trying to do, right? Because my opinion on sponsorship in general, right? Anybody can throw a sign up on center field wall and say, I'm a sponsor. Sponsorship's all about activation, and that activation takes a million different forms and opportunities in terms of how you drive that activation. Gone are the days of just throwing that sign on the board. Yes, it's a vital part of the sponsorship, but if you're not building around that piece through some sort of integrated activation plan, you're wasting your time and money. And that comes in all forms or fashions. So whether it's understanding the in-broadcast media, like you just asked through a brand effect study, or it's more on-site understanding of the activation in place and whether or not consumers are interacting with your brand on site and what they're taking with them after they leave that interaction. It's all part of the puzzle.
When you're home watching sports and you see certain brands attached to certain programming or any form of programming, I mean, what are you thinking as you're watching that you know that you wish somebody knew something when they were placing that running that campaign that you know? And how we all yell at the TV. I'm a sports guy, so I yell at the TV constantly. It's gotten worse since my kids left home because now I sit alone in a room and yell at a TV, which is really sad. At least when they were there was a semblance of some degree of social interaction. But when you're yelling at the TV and you see brands, what would you tell a brand manager? What would you tell a media buyer that they didn't know?
Simplicity is the key. Right, so when we look at television exposure from a sponsorship standpoint, so not traditional media, but in-game sponsorship, simplicity is the key. I think some of the things that we see that are let's say, bad examples, so an LED field board in soccer or a dasher board in hockey, we see a lot of text 555 to win XYZ, to get a trip to this, to this, to this, to that. It's too much in a small space. You're much better served driving simple branding in that space on TV and using the in-arena ribbon boards for driving your actual message, right? Because on TV, the exposure is so quick and so fast that big, complicated messages from a sponsorship standpoint just don't translate, right? Use the rest of your assets to drive that. Use social media to drive that. Use your in-venue ribbon boards to drive it. But don't use that prime real estate with a complicated message. One of my, I guess, disappointments is that sports has ruined me to an extent that I can't watch a game just for the pure enjoyment of watching the game. I actually vividly remember the last time I yelled at the TV for sports. It was Doug Bryan missing 2 field goals for the Jets in 2004. I mean, that was 14 years ago. That was the last time I was able to disassociate myself from the business of sport.
The hardest thing about being in the business of sports is I'm a Giant fan, so I kind of hate the Patriots.
Yeah, same here.
And sorry, but when I know the feeling, right? Because I manage Yahoo Sports. We were very fortunate to have the Super Bowl on our app this year. You want to put the biggest number up you possibly can, and I'm sitting there watching that AFC Championship game. You know, every kind of sports narrative bone in my body wants to see Jacksonville go up there and steal that game away. You want to hit your damn quarter bone in my body was, we kind of need the Patriots to win this game for a big Super Bowl. Andrew Lafiosca, thank you very much for being here this morning.
Appreciate it. Yeah.